and I see we've got a really good contingent of diamond geologists and others, so most welcome. I'd just like to introduce our speaker of the day, who is Keith Scott. I think many people, or most people in the minerals business, know Keith, and certainly his father, Mike Scott, as well, who was a long-time geologist with JCI. So Keith started working in the minerals industry in 1995 as a field technician, like many, and his first assignment was in fact running kimberlite exploration and evaluation plants at the KLIPSPRINGER Marsfontein project, which he's going to talk about today. Keith then graduated as a geologist in 2001 and went into the consulting business with MSA, Mike Scott and Associates, the company that Mike set up. Thereafter, he's had a good steady rise through the ranks of the minerals industry. He then joined the Royal Buffer King Group, and then PIC, the PIC PIC Investment Corporation, who own a mining, oil and gas services called MOGS. And Keith was asked to join MOGS in 2016 as the CEO of their mining services portfolio. He's currently a dual CEO, so he's CEO of MOGS, and he's also CEO of Fraser Alexander, which is a large, I guess they do contracting, consulting, project development, particularly in the mining business. So thanks, Keith, for making time today to talk about Marsfontein. It was a fascinating development and project, and we'll leave you to give us the story, and then we look forward to discussion at the end. Thanks very much. Go for it.
Thank you, John, and morning, everybody. And yeah, it was a fascinating exploration and development success, but it was also a lot of fun. And I'm going to try and get that across as I present to you all, just around what an incredible experience it was from all sorts of perspectives. Just to touch on relevance, because it's now 23 years since discovery, which was in 1997, and 25 years since we started exploration out there. It remains a very significant diamond find in South Africa, a recent diamond find in South Africa. It demonstrates that high-risk diamond exploration does pay. It demonstrates that areas that may have been covered can still have potential. And it very much demonstrates, as we'll go through, that tried and trusted exploration methodology, systematically applied, works. So I'm going to go through the exploration strategy that Mike Scott had at the time, the exploration methodology that we applied, the discovery and evaluation of KLIPSPRINGER and Marsfontein. We'll just have a quick look at Marsfontein economics and wrap up with some key takeaways and then questions. So the remarkable thing about Marsfontein, there are a number of remarkable things, but what stands out in people's minds is how rich it was, both throughout its life, but especially during the first few weeks, months of its mining. And I think very few mines can say they recouped their capital in less than a week. However, there's a story behind that as well, and I'll touch a little bit on that when I get there a little bit later. So I try to pause here for a second to explain MSA and Mike Scott and Associates and how all of these things came into being and where they are now. So Mike, who's sitting here with me, happy to answer questions later, left JCI in 1983 and established a consulting business, contracting consulting business, at that time called Mike Scott and Associates, and I think the work was pretty slim picking out there. But he certainly managed to keep things ticking along until the late 80s or early 90s, when there was all of a sudden a lot of interest in South Africa from foreign investment in our sector, and the business really grew from there. But it was a project-focused business, and MSA we know today is a purely consulting business, which is no longer owned by us. And in 2000, in fact, the businesses were split into a projects business, which Mike then owned and ran, and a exploration consulting and broader consulting business, which I then ran, which we subsequently consulted the Royal Buffer King, and then I moved from there into the Royal Buffer King group. So I just wanted to pause and explain that, because we tend to jump around between Mike Scott and Associates and MSA, but at that time it was Mike Scott and Associates, and very much Mike's business. So the philosophy was exploration on craton, to target known diamondiferous kimberlite fissure systems, and extensively. You'd be amazed how much work we were doing then, how large our labs were, how many people were employed, how many field teams we had out doing primary diamond exploration in South Africa. It was fantastic, and we haven't seen anything like it since, really. Targeting known kimberlite fissure systems in the Northern Cape, in the Free State, in Mpumalanga and Limpopo. So probably 8 or 9 projects running at that stage, using reconnaissance road sampling techniques. We were also undertaking primary greenfield exploration, but that has, and as can be demonstrated from this, it's much more expensive and has a much lower hit rate. I want to pause a little bit on reconnaissance road sampling techniques and just discuss how incredibly effective these are. So these are driving around your target areas, stopping where you see streams, sampling upstream of the road, selecting good trap sites, screening your samples appropriately, taking good stream sediment samples, and then processing them appropriately and interpreting any concentrate appropriately. And it's an incredibly effective technique and allows you to cover large areas relatively cheaply, or very large areas relatively cheaply. And in fact, we applied this technique in Swaziland, and we successfully explored the whole country, starting with 5 kilometer center, approximately 5 kilometer center stream sediment sampling techniques. We followed up that stream sediment sampling by soil sampling, and then where one had found anomalies, one then increased the resolution of that soil sampling, and in that way delineated targets for geophysical application of geophysical techniques and the application of ultimately drilling, and then delineation and evaluation if it was warranted. So as we know, exploration without funding doesn't work, and in those days, Mike had developed in the early 90s, a number of relationships with both majors, mostly majors in fact, and some juniors who were very keen to enter the South African exploration and mining space. And Mike developed relationships with 3 or 4 of them who funded probably at any one time 10, 12, maybe 14 projects, diamonds and other commodities, platinum, gold, in South Africa and elsewhere. And it was a real honeymoon period for exploration in South Africa, attracting investment here to do primary greenfield exploration was imminently doable. And it's important to have that source of ready funds. Otherwise, exploration becomes extremely difficult. And then, of course, those ready funds have got to see themselves putting much more capital investment into mining development to make the project truly successful. And that's the scenario we had at the time. And without that, we wouldn't have had these successes. So in this particular area, we initiated exploration southeast of Mokopane, which was then Port Pietersrus. In the area, the Zebedela area, if you know it, if you take the road traveling east out of Port Pietersrus towards Zebedela, and Laboa into the old Sekekuni land, then you will pass through the Zebedela Orange Estate, and this work was undertaken really in that greater area, in the hills above the Karoo, that on the left-hand side of that road as you drive out of Port Pietersrus. So we assumed initiated this exploration in 1993 along trend directions of known kimberlite fissures. I want to talk a little bit about how we treated these samples. We took the samples in field, stream sediment, as I say, followed up by soil sampling of the appropriate horizon, screened in field, then further screened back at camp and dried, or by hand. We used to use the sun to dry our samples. And what we did, and we did this very successfully in South Africa, in Swaziland, and in India, was we set up hand jigging field labs to pre-treat the samples. So what we had is and I'm sorry that I lost all my pictures on a stolen laptop 10 or 15 years ago, but we had a jig that looked very much like a paint tin, about the size of a paint tin. And you would put your screen in the middle, you would open it up, fill it with water, put your screen in, and then it had a little handle, and you used to use that to jig the screen samples and very effectively develop concentrates, which we then sent through to Joburg for microscope picking for kimberlite indicated minerals and even diamonds in some of the exploration samples. So that worked extremely well. It's low tech, it's low cost, and it works extremely well. And another point I wanted to make there is that doing everything as cost effectively and as well as possible is an absolute essential to any successful exploration program, especially at this time of very limited funding. And the philosophy of spending all the money in the ground with no frills, and I can assure you, working for Mike in those days, there were absolutely no frills, is the most successful way to go about exploration like this. And as a brief aside, you know, we work in a world now, a very different world. The employment of geologists is very different to how it was when I was employed 25 years ago. I mean, when you were employed even before that, and Mike first started his career in the Zambezi River Valley in the late 50s. Things have changed very much over those years, but working for Mike in the late 90s, you got a break when the job was finished. So the poor guys who got sent to India got a break every 6 or 7 months. When Mike had deemed that they had sufficiently finished their work and it was sufficiently wet for them to be allowed to come home. So it was a different type of philosophy, but it was extremely cost effective and extremely effective. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on the geology here. I think there's a couple of important things to note. Where you see that black line, that is the kimberlite, the KLIPSPRINGER fissure. What you see north of the Karoo contact is really a range of hills running east-west. The Tabazimbi Murchison lineament runs very sympathetic to this and not far off. And there's the large structure in the area is also running sympathetic to that east-west, the larger east-west structures. The Karoo is, and you can see this geology beautifully when you drive in that area, the Karoo is that very flat-lying ground to the right of the road if you're driving outside of Mokopane, and it stretches all the way really to the north of Pretoria, those Karoo flats, which have some very successful farming on them. Springbok flats, sorry, the Springbok flats, which have good water and good farming. And then to the left-hand side of the road, you've got these hills with variable geology, but the area in which we identified or followed up on the KLIPSPRINGER fissure was in the Malmani Dolomites. Here's a picture of some kimberlite indicator minerals. What we were doing was kimberlite indicator mineral sampling, stream sediment followed up by soil sampling. There's a lot of diamond geologists on this call. They'll be very familiar with these techniques. And first of all, this isn't the best picture of kimberlite indicator minerals, but I left it in because these are indicators from that project. And in fact, one of them is a diamond, which of course is in itself a kimberlite indicator mineral. And really the main point here was that we were applying very much tried and tested techniques based on good science and good field logistics, because one of the challenges when you're undertaking sampling is that you generate a lot of samples. You generate a lot of samples together, you tend to backlog your laboratories, and having good sampling logistics, both in terms of taking the samples, how you screen them, how you dry them, how you package them, making sure that you don't mix them up, because in this type of work, an anomaly can be based on one positive sample. And if there's been a sample mix-up, you can go chasing your tail, which we have done in the past for weeks or even longer before you realize that you've been following up a false anomaly. So making sure that your samples are treated very, very well, and that sampling logistics, sample receipt, which is often where these mix-up happens, is very well done, and it's difficult when you start getting into thousands of samples. This is just having a look at some of the initial road reconnaissance results. We've included the Marsfontein Diamond Mine site. However, that wasn't discovered as a result of these results. These results were taken upstream of that. However, it's just demonstrating that what we used to do is we'd stop along these roads, and we did this in thousands of square kilometers in South Africa, and De Beers did it in tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of square kilometers in many countries around the world. And we stopped and we just sampled upstream of the road where we found, not in every case upstream, but mostly upstream of the road where we found good trap sites and where we found samples and positive or anomalous samples. And of course, that's a relative thing. We then followed up on those samples. These are some of the early stage anomalies that we were picking up in 93 and 94, so well before the evaluation of KLIPSPRINGER and the discovery of Marsfontein. And it's a long time ago that I was a geoscientist, so I'm not going to go into detailed exploration of this garnet analysis, and there are many people on this call who could. But I think, again, it's just applying the principle of undertaking the systematic exploration, understanding what makes for an anomalous sample, ensuring that you have good laboratory techniques, good analysis, good interpretation, and in that way selecting where and what to follow up. Because a large part of the science of exploration or the trick in exploration is knowing what to follow up and what not to follow up, so that you only spend a limited amount of time and money that you have on what is truly anomalous. Also, some chromite analysis from the initial sampling, and the more of these initial samples that we saw, the more excited that we started to get that we were in an area where there were unknown kimberlite discoveries, and that those kimberlites had good chemistry and good diamond carrying and preservation potential. I just want to pause here a little bit and talk about funding and how important it is. And that might seem obvious, but for those of us who've tried to continue to do exploration in a world of very little funding, sometimes I wonder if we follow our own guidance, because exciting targets deserve to be followed up and deserve to be resolved. But if one cannot find a significant funding, and if there isn't appetite for funding post-exploration, then really one's got to ask the question why one's doing it in certain jurisdictions. So by mid-1993, Mike had undertaken this work at his own risk and cost, and that was his model at the time. He would undertake a certain amount of work at his own risk and cost, and then when he felt he had sufficiently attractive targets, he would then go and engage with majors or juniors to fund the work going forward. So we knew we had exciting targets, but no parties were interested at that stage in funding, as it was still grassroots. However, some entrants started coming into the market, notably BHP and REA on the majors side. RECCE was very active in exploring at that time too, and a number of Canadian juniors, I think really spearheaded by Southern Era, which was headed up by Chris Jennings, with whom Mike had a very long-standing relationship, and I'm sure you all know who Chris Jennings is and what he's managed to achieve in his career. But Mike and Chris then formed a very strong partnership, which led to a number of successful discoveries and even a number of development of mines over the next several years. So I think that's an example of a very good partnership and what a good partnership like that can produce. Chris agreed with the findings, and he agreed to fund ongoing exploration. And in those days, you literally fed the market your exploration results almost as you got them. And luckily, we were getting ongoing good results. And Southern Era was very quickly started to see a rise in their share price and ability to raise more and more money, which of course fueled this program. And this was their principal program at the time. We then started a campaign of acquiring a lot of mineral rights. And I can't remember where we ended up. They had 11 or 12 farms, many more than that, maybe 20 farms that we held in that area, following a similar philosophy or strategy to what I spoke about earlier. And we started systematically sampling all of this ground, paid for by Southern Era. And MSA, just to remind you, this is actually Mike Scott and Associates at that time. What we then did, we had a handheld screening and jigging operation, which works well up to a certain point. But now we had literally hundreds of samples coming in. So we set up a mechanical screening and sample jigging plant for these exploration samples at our camp, which was near Zebedela. We hired a beautiful old farmhouse, 2 farmhouses, which is often what we did. We went to farmers and found a house they weren't using, hired it cheaply, and set up our little laboratories, or our little sampling plants outside the house, and dried our samples in the yard. And that's really how low-tech and cost-effectively we ran many of these campaigns. However, here we set up a mechanical screening and sample jigging operation, which we've set up several that have worked very well, where we found we had a high volume of samples, a number in South Africa. We set up one as well in Sierra Leone. Frida knows the project very well in the early mid-2000s. And these are basic and inexpensive pieces of equipment. They work very well. They work on very basic principles. They're easy to maintain, and they're easy to keep jigging efficiently. And they stood us in very good stead for this program, which is now, as I say, starting to generate hundreds of samples. It's worth noting for a number of reasons that KLIPSPRINGER was developed first. We delineated the fissure system further, and that was largely completed, certainly in terms of identifying areas that we could delineate through drilling and evaluate through percussion drilling methods in 1994. We then commenced bulk sampling of the fissure system using percussion drilling methods, large diameter, about 8-inch, 12-inch diameter. In those days, there was very little available in terms of exploration techniques, drilling techniques, drilling companies. It was still much more basic relative to what it is today. And we used pretty much straightforward 8-inch, 10-inch percussion drilling. We did in later programs move on to RC drilling and triconing and fancier, more expensive methods. But in those days, we used straight percussion. And we set up a very rudimentary and well-used, actually, multiple stacked screen jig. And we treated the RC or the percussion drill chips through it. And when I say rudimentary, we bought this jig out of the Kimberley area, out of the Northern Cape area. When I say it was well used, it may well have been decades old. We serviced it and we changed the screening out. And what it was it's a tank, maybe about 1,000 liters steel tank. And in it, you've got a stack of jigs working on one mechanism that jig up and down with a slight eccentric motion, a slight twisting motion. So I suppose very akin to panning. And they stacked with the coarser screens on top and the finer screens below. And you want to split them up into 4 or 5 different ranges in order to make sure that your recovery is as efficient and effective as possible. And then we used this very inexpensive, I can't believe we paid more than a few $100 for it, and very effective jig to then do the evaluation, not only of KLIPSPRINGER, but we also used the same jig in our diamond recovery plant for the first weeks and months of Marsfontein. It was a very exciting time. I ran this plant and the exploration plant for the business, and it was extremely exciting because you could commonly see diamonds visible in the screens. So you take the screens out, you flip them over. It's a bit of an art because they actually get very, very heavy, and you've got to become quite practiced at flipping them over perfectly. And then in the center, you put in some traces which run in 3.53 SG, and you take out your traces, and your traces delineate your area of concentrate well. You take out your concentrate, you bag it, and then we would do that twice. And then you send the concentrate down to Johannesburg. So we ran a very low-key program here. So we didn't react if we saw diamonds. We didn't take them out and put them aside. We just put the concentrate in the bag and sent it to Joburg. And in those days, all we did, very simple system, Mike would come up once a week, and Mike would literally drive these samples, both the exploration samples, and then when we started recovering diamonds, these diamond samples back to Joburg in his Cressida for sorting in the office. So even Mike's choice of car was cost effective and efficient. We continued with an extensive regional sampling exploration program at the time. And then we commenced trial mining on KLIPSPRINGER in 1996. At the same time, we built a pan plant. I think it was 2 10-foot pans up on the mountain. Again, we bought used pans out of the Kimberley area, out of that greater area, and we serviced them, refurbished them. And the way we did that is the way we ran all of this is the people who operated the pan plant literally had something broke, they'd pull out the welder and they'd weld it on the spot. If something went wrong in my plant, I'd go buy a bearing and change it. I couldn't do that now, but that's how we used to do it then. So it was very, very hands-on. We then set up a more secure diamond recovery facility, which literally consisted of a container with some fencing, with exactly the same jig plant I've just described, the stacked jig plant. And we got a used grease table. I think we were horrified because we had to pay about 8,000 Rand for it or something like that. It was certainly in the thousands of Rands. And we got a used grease table, which we used to run the tailings from the jig plant over. We brought the concentrate down from the mountain, from up at KLIPSPRINGER in milk pails. They worked very well for this purpose. We locked them and put a security tag on them, a uniquely numbered security tag. They were brought down, given to me. I would break the tag in front of a witness. Tags were put on in the mountain in front of a witness. And in that way, we ran a very effective and secure evaluation operation. This was extremely exciting because obviously we're now dealing with a concentrate of a concentrate, and sometimes I'd flip the screen over and literally the screen was more than half covered in diamonds. So it was extremely, extremely exciting. We found a number of quite large stones, a 10-carat stone, a 17-carat stone, a number in the range of 5 to 8 carats, and many, many, many smaller stones. And it was extremely exciting. However, we didn't change the way we operated. Mike continued to take these samples up to Joburg and his Cressida for sampling there, or for sorting there. And in fact, Mike was telling me that he was so low key he would go to the bank with diamonds in a pick and pay, or probably a Checkers in those days, shopping bag, and just deposit them. And we ran a very, very low key operation, which worked very, very well until we found that at some stage people. The word had gotten out that we were finding diamonds, and we had to change our security process or approach. Again, we continued with extensive regional sampling. This here is just showing some of the Marsfontein, this follow-up on stream sediment sampling. Then, as I say, we started to do grit soil sampling, increasingly high resolution. And this is just showing the 1 kilometer RECCE sampling. Typically, we'd start on 2 kilometer or 1 kilometer, go down to 500 meters, 200 meters, 50 meters. That kind of approach, depending what we were looking for, and then drill on those targets. We'd quite often use geophysics along the way, but normally only once we had a delineated anomaly we were comfortable with. This is just showing these numbers here are just garnet counts, but we also started finding diamonds in some of these exploration samples, and that got us particularly excited. This is a 200-meter grid, which we followed up on the previous grid on. And you can start to see that we just contoured here the garnet results, and you can start to see how you can start to develop bullseye targets for drilling, further sampling and drilling delineation. This is Marsfontein on a contour and a 50-meter grid. Garnet counts contoured on a 50-meter grid. Chemistry continued to be very exciting, and as we said, we started to recover more and more diamonds out of these exploration samples. The M1 pipe was blind, and it was drilled in 1997, March of 1997, by a young woman geologist we had, Frenette Feltman. She was a graduate of RAU at the time, University of Johannesburg now. She's since retired from geology, and she put the first drill hole into this. And I can't tell you how exciting it was. I actually left the program at around about this time, shortly thereafter, to go study. But it was just an incredibly exciting time with exciting exploration results, exciting evaluation results, and then the intersection of what we knew was going to be, or what we expected to be, a very rich kimberlite on Marsfontein. We started rapidly adding more rigs after this first intersection in 1997, and we quickly outlined a target measuring 90 meters by 45 meters of surface, so not a big target. This narrowed at a depth of about 140 meters to a 10-meter wide dike-like body. And this is just utilizing this is Marsfontein, this is just an idealized kimberlite system, just to identify that we were in or close to the root zone. We identified a number of blows. We were working on evaluating some fissures, and then Marsfontein would have seen quite an extreme amount of weathering that resulted in it being close to or within the root zone. We rarely brought in geophysics almost after the fact. We only brought in magnetics when we had well delineated a target and we were doing intense sampling prior to doing delineation drilling, if I remember correctly. And it wasn't a great magnetic target. As you can see, or can't really see from this picture, it wasn't a terribly good magnetic target. However, post-discovery, we did run some baseline gravity. We ran baseline gravity, and it was much better delineated on geophysical gravity surveys, and we then started using gravity as another technique more broadly in exploration in this area. So microdiamond counts indicated a high grade, as confirmed by excellent garnet and chromite chemistry. We used the same jig and grease table for the evaluation of Marsfontein in the early days. Exactly as I say, we probably didn't pay more than a few £100 for that initial jig. We continued to use large diameter percussion drilling, and this confirmed a high-grade source. The decision to mine was based on really not a lot. I mean, nowadays we would have done much more work, bankable feasibility study, but in those days the funding was easily available. There was a lot of excitement from Southern Era, from their shareholders. Results were very good, and the decision to move into mining was easily taken. And again, probably much more easily taken than it would be now. However, the funding was available, and we didn't have to approach banks for funding in those days, which made it a very different proposition. In June '98, an agreement was concluded to mine the pipe in conjunction with De Beers. I just want to point out here that a plant had already been built at KLIPSPRINGER. We discovered a small blow kind of northeast of the KLIPSPRINGER fissure. And when I say a small blow, a very small blow, but it was rich. And we mined that blow using a new plant, a DMS and flow sort plant. And the capital of that plant was actually, where we had gotten to date, was actually paid back by that blow. So we used the same plant for the mining of Marsfontein. So Marsfontein Payback did not need to include a plant whose capitalization we had already paid back from the blow. So Marsfontein was a small surface expression, overburden up to 15 meters. Side diminished to a broad dike at 150 meters. It was mined open pit to 150 meters. And east-west kimberlite dike cuts through the pipe. We commenced mining in the 31st of August 1998, so very quickly after having delineated and evaluated it. In the first 2 days, we recovered 40,000 carats from 2,700 tons. The first month, 165,000 carats. The value per ton of the first month's production was $934, which was a lot of money in those days. There's a lot of money today per ton of mine material. And the value of that first month's production was $23 million. So you can see how all of the money spent, and especially the capitalization spent on the mine, which consisted mostly of establishment and stripping, was repaid very, very quickly. That was that 29 million rand of capital. So bear in mind that the plant had been capitalized for the dikes and the blow, and was actually repaid back from that work. The weathered kimberlite grade was very high, 509 carats per 100 tons. The unweathered grade was also high, and then as we got further dilution, as we mined deeper, that grade obviously dropped. We treated this material at the KLIPSPRINGER plant until the end of 2000. It reached the economic limit of mining at 150 meters, and in total produced 1.8 million carats. Further low-grade stock piles from gravels around the pipe and stock work were then mined in 2001. So the average recovered grade was 1.9 carats a ton in the first 2 days, 1,400 carats per 100 tons in the first month, 667 carats per 100 tons. Average value per carat wasn't bad, $128, $129 a carat, good value in those days, and the total revenue was $246 million, which was a lot of money 20 years ago, and there's a lot of money today, and a lot of money to recover over such a short period. We produced a number of special stones, plus 10.8 carats was our cutoff for these special stones. The largest of 145 carats. It was part of a larger carat stone that was found broken into 5 pieces, and when put together it was missing a piece, but it would have originally been a plus 400 carat stone. 4 stones over 100 carats, and many stones ranging between 40 and 100 carats. The Marsfontein grade, very high, as I said, in the weathered material, very consistent when we had more consistent stripping ratios and more consistent dilution, and then lower as we diluted further. Our total mining cost, this is kept at a very high level, about 200 rand a ton, and this just shows our revenue relative to our cost, and revenue on average was running 10 times cost. And at some stages we were running 4,000 rand a ton revenue against the 200 rand in the beginning, at 200 rand a ton cost. And that's just showing the same data in a different way. Average margin 91%, revenue was roughly 10 times cost of mining. So some conclusions: the discovery of Marsfontein proved that small pipes can be extremely lucrative. Changed diamond exploration philosophy in terms of target size. I think in a lot of people's eyes, certainly in ours, and a lot of people who were involved, and a lot of people who knew in the industry, showed that there's still potential for significant finds in areas already covered. Proved once again the value of the application of proven techniques applied in very much a systematic fashion. And as excited as we got, we just kept being systematic and consistent, systematic and consistent, and systematic and consistent. Also to point out that cost efficiency is a very important factor in exploration. Spending money unwisely probably kills more exploration programs than poor results do. So you have to achieve a lot for a little, and you have to put as much of that money at the ground as possible. And then a final point is that you can only explore where you can easily raise exploration and development capital. It just is impossible, especially now, to fund these sorts of programs and to have a hope of developing good exploration targets into mines, unless there is money fairly readily available. Just some acknowledgements to Mike, who now runs Minix and in partnership Panix, still exploring in South Africa, Africa, and in Europe at the moment. And acknowledgements to Chris Jennings, who also remains somewhat active in the business. Just some pictures quickly. 23rd of October 1998. This is 18 months after the first discovery drill hole. And a picture in 14th of April 1999. This is quite well advanced, 2 years after discovery. I think that's my last slide. Yes, I am happy to take questions. John, any?
Keith, thanks very much. That was excellent. I'm sure there'll be a whole bunch of questions. I certainly have quite a few, and some of mine will go back to the whole mineral rights situation, which I think you sort of alluded to it right at the front. Why back then was it easy or easier to actually get hold of ground and do projects like this and raise money in the process? But anyway, let's open it up. People can unmute themselves and put their videos on so we can see everyone, and let's have some discussion. And Mike, is Mike there? Mike, maybe you just want to kick off and give a little bit of your experience running projects like this back then.
Thanks, John. Well, I think Keith has covered the ground very well, and probably much better than I could have, and also demonstrated to me that his memory is much better than my 80-year-old memory.
Looking good for an 80-year-old, Mike.
However, yes, I think that the main point is to raise exploration funds. It's become extremely difficult worldwide, but in South Africa, it's become, I would say, impossible.
Yeah.
It's just not possible to raise money. And the perhaps for me slightly irritating thing is that you can raise money for DRC, and even people raise money for Zimbabwe exploration, but South Africa, no chance. So we've done a really good PR job here, which we can be proud of. I think it's unique.
That's a great.
In those days, you touched on something, John. It was also much easier to pick up mineral rights. We were still working under the old Act.
Private rights.
You picked it up from the state and state-owned ground, or you picked it up from the landowner in ground where, if it was state, there was a landowner who had first right on the state mineral rights. And that made it relatively easy to pick up ground and do exploration. Now, of course, you're dealing with communities. You're dealing with, I think the last mineral right we applied for in South Africa took 3 years to actually process the application. It's just so cumbersome and unwieldy and expensive that it's basically hardly worth doing.
Yeah.
What else can I tell you?
No, I mean, let's get some other views and opinions. And I think the other great thing about it, Mike, is it highlights, as Keith said, small is beautiful. And if you look around this country, we have many small deposits. Adrian Reynolds, for example, talked about Consmerch a month or two ago. I mean, there's another example of what should be a small mine and create jobs and royalties and taxes and so on. Anyway, Henny, you lead the charge there and get some questions going.
Okay, guys, just put up your hand if you want to speak, or just start speaking. Unmute yourself.
Okay.
Ron, I can probably talk a bit to the mineral rights as it existed.
I was going to ask you exactly to do that. Please go for it.
Okay. Firstly, Keith, thanks for a great presentation. I think it was really excellent. You certainly spoke to a lot of the issues regarding diamond exploration that I certainly share. And there we go. Been asked to put on my video. Switch on a backlight, otherwise I look like a terrorist. Yeah, so certainly with regard to the mineral rights situation in South Africa at that time, even pre-1991, the new minerals that came in, it was much easier to explore than people gave the country credit for. I think one of the arguments for changing the Act in the first place was that international players claimed that South Africa's mineral rights situation made it very difficult for them to operate because of patchwork style mineral rights and too many rights held by individual companies that weren't doing anything with them. And there was merit to the second part of the argument, but certainly I agree with Mike's view that it was certainly doable if you were committed and you were intended doing any exploration. All that you did was approach a landowner or a mineral rights owner, and you would negotiate access in some way. We all know how the option system worked. And if something significant was discovered, it led to, certainly in my view, a win-win situation between both the mineral right owner, the discoverer, and the surface landowner, because at that time the surface landowner had to be bought out. Now, there were areas of difficulty, and the main areas of difficulty were, in my view at that time, around the what would be termed the traditional homeland areas. And certainly from De Beers' point of view, my whole career with De Beers, 30-odd years, I was in virtual continuous negotiation with various homeland governments, South African Bantu Trust, whatever their names were, Laboa Minerals Trust, and so on. Certainly through 20-odd years of those 30 years, two-thirds of that time. And basically, certainly in the so-called tribal areas, I think what is ironic is that although there was a lot of state land within some of those areas, a lot of those mineral rights actually were held in trust for communities. And what people didn't realize was with the new change in the mineral rights, all those communities lost their rights to the state. That's been lost in the historical record that actually happened. And where they occupied surface rights, they had, certainly in terms of the old Precious Stones Act, they would in the Transvaal, because again, it's a complex, South African mineral rights history is quite complex. But certainly they would have had the right to share in a surface owner's share in any mineral discovery. So it's quite a complex setup. But the mineral rights were accessible in my view, and there were hiccups, there were difficulties, but if you were committed and you had the capability to get things done, it was all doable. And certainly, you know, on the De Beers side, De Beers negotiated agreements with, you know, Rand Mines, with Anglo-Val, other groups to access the mineral rights. And, you know, post-independence of places like Baputa's so-called independence of Bophuthatswana, Venda, they negotiated access to those areas and were able to cover the areas quite effectively and report on them. All those results were reported to, you know, the various government departments in those areas at that time. What happened to them after the event, but many of the areas I covered, you know, were covered by teams under my control, and you know, I can still look at those maps and know exactly who did what, when it was done, and all that type of thing, and probably in my mind's eye, you know, what the results were like. So that's just my view on the background to mineral rights situation as it existed. My experience was mainly in the Transvaal and Free State, and obviously directed towards the precious stones rights, which changed in 1991 with the bringing in of the Minerals Act. And the Minerals Act of 1991 made it easier, in my view, and it's a pity that the Minerals Act was repealed and replaced by what we now have, which has become an obstacle to any exploration. It's actually, in my view, dispossessed lots of people of rights that they should have been able to retain and obtain value from. That's individuals, communities, families, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%, Bill. I mean, I think we all agree with you. It's just got almost impossible to manage mineral rights. And just going back, I think these rights that Marsfontein was on were originally in the Rand Mines package, MinReco, wasn't it? The stuff that I think Mark and Rob Lindsay had put together, and you guys, you mentioned working mostly in the Transvaal. I think you had a deal on big areas of Rand Mines, or Rand Mines rights, if I'm correct.
Yeah, De Beers had an agreement with Rand Mines. The farms, you know, the company names, the Rand Mines subsidiaries at that time were Transvaal Consolidated Lands, TCL, and Transvaal and Delagoa Bay Investment Company. Those were the two main subsidiaries. But TCL was the main subsidiary, and the rights to Marsfontein, the farm is very subdivided, but the bulk of the portions of the mineral rights were held by Rand Mines. But the northeastern portion on which the Marsfontein deposit was discovered were held in an intestate estate. Yeah. And
well, there's another fascinating story about that too, in terms of, you know, the unraveling of the rights and going back to the heirs, and, you know, that's for another presentation. We should get Manda Skerpers back in the loop.
Yeah, I think that's quite a you know, that's a story on its own.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think there's enough time
not today.
Yeah. But historically, as you know, as Keith mentioned, the Rusland kimberlites had been discovered. I think that we got the first indications of that in the early. Well, interesting. Actually, stepping back, really, you know, the first indication came out in road and stream sampling done in around 1970, 71. I can't remember the name of the guy who was responsible for the work. But it's lost in the midst of time in my brain. Yeah. Then there was a single, you know, just as you know, as Keith indicated there, that road and stream sampling, it's called skeletal sampling in those days, really arose out of a strategy developed after the Orapa discovery. So the whole Transvaal was covered by stream sampling. And there was one garnet anomaly on Marsfontein next to the road. And when my teams were down at Palmytgat in those days in the late 70s, I sent one of my field officers up to go and collect a couple of additional samples, and they came out positive. But it's the old story, certainly with a company like De Beers. You know, what do you do first? You've got Palmytgat, you just found Venetia. And we found Marsfontein, and then while the mineral rights, we found Rusland, and then while the mineral rights situation was all getting sorted out, we found the Oaks, and then went on to that, and so it went on. So the first initial indications of Rusland were around 1980-81. One of the guys went up and did some more work there in the mid-80s, 85, 86, when Alex Scott was in the Transvaal office. And then I think James Campbell was there in the late 80s, early to mid-90s. So Rusland would have been the late 80s, if I recall correctly. But we never dug a hole into it. We knew diamondiferous, but weren't interested in the dikes. The mineral rights there actually belonged to Barclays Bank, believe it or not.
Okay. All right.
So I've rambled on for long enough now.
Yeah. Thanks.
We've got Mike R with his hand up. Mike, want to unmute yourself?
Thanks, John. It's actually not me, it's Michelle who has the question. Here we go.
Hi guys. I have two questions. The first one is, in both KLIPSPRINGER and Marsfontein, what colored diamonds did you find? And the second question is, do you think that the fact that this was all done before RECCE made a difference to how cheaply you were able to do the exploration?
Interesting. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, John.
Yeah, so the stones were a mixture of some brown stones. There were some included stones and then some clear stones, if I remember correctly. I didn't work as much with Marsfontein as Mike did, much with the diamond. And I think there were some inclusions that cleaned up quite well, if I remember correctly. Some surface contamination that cleaned up quite well. But I think the colors were okay, as evidenced by the price. But there were certainly in KLIPSPRINGER, where I worked, a fair amount of brownstone.
Yeah, in terms of or oranges or sort of blues, nothing like that.
No fancy, none at all. In terms of did exploration become more expensive after RECCE? I don't think this type of exploration had to be. Obviously, applying QA/QC is important, but we applied it as a matter of course, I would say, in terms of our, we had procedures and protocols for everything, how we took samples very consistently, how we treated them very consistently, retreated them, followed up on some of them, kept all the pulps. So no, I think you could, RECCE isn't what changed the world that much, I don't think. I think there are other factors. I think if one had funding, though, one could still go out and do exploration like this very successfully and relatively cost effectively in certain parts of the world, I have no doubt. MSA did a program in Mongolia over the last couple of years, and they were extremely effective, both time-wise and cost-wise, because they had relatively unhindered access to ground. And of course, there's very little there in the way of built-up ground, and local communities can be relatively easily dealt with. So I think there are still opportunities to do very cost-effective and very effective exploration, but they seem to becoming less and less. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Other questions? Anyone else?
Just a short question.
John.
The Marsfontein mined only down to 150 meters. I understand it probably was due to stripping ratio. If you changed the mining method, was there a possibility of going deeper? I mean, it's unusual for a diamond deposit to change grade that rapidly vertically.
It was considered, but you know, you were never dealing with a big body, and by that stage you were dealing with a really small body. So certainly the economics were run at the time, and it was considered uneconomic. And yeah, there hasn't been any significant subsequent work on those known kimberlites that we're aware of.
I mean, maybe Jimmy wants to comment on the if he's still on the call, on the KLIPSPRINGER fishes, Jim. Is he there? Not. Okay, I don't see him. He must have gone back to work. All right.
If I can just ask you guys, after, you know, with the changing of the Mineral Rights Act, what happened to the digger's license? How was that affected? Could one still get one into perpetuity, or what happened to the digger's license?
Oh, we really weren't involved in any digging operations. We looked at some ground a few times, but we never really, apart from some consulting work on the MSA side, Mike never really looked seriously at digging opportunities. So we wouldn't really know. Well, I certainly wouldn't know. John certainly would be able to answer that question, John.
Yeah, Henny, today there's still in the Act, you have prospecting rights and mining rights, and then there's really aimed at the diggers. There's a 5 hectare. It used to be smaller. I think it started as 1 hectare mining permit, and today it's grown to a 5 hectare mining permit, and you should in theory be able to get that awarded quickly. But I mean, the comment was made in the talk a bit earlier about it taking 3 years to get a prospecting right. I mean, I've had experience, and right now, real experience, and maybe Michelle can comment. I mean, it can take up to 4 years to get a prospecting right, and a great deal longer to get a mining right. And then I've been helping a black gentleman at Bakerville, which, as everyone will know in the diamond business, has been mined and reworked since, for about 90 years. It's an old locality and been really worked over. And he's applied for a 5 hectare mine permit. And man, we sort of 10 months into the process in the Klerksdorp office, and it's just an absolute mission. I mean, we've already paid 50,000 Rand and have nothing to show for it. And if you go there today, the place is being stripped by the Zamas. But we want to actually have a session on how we can fix and change and improve the situation in South Africa in our mineral rights, and start looking for these smaller type deposits again. But we'll do that on another day.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is back in the day, De Beers used to issue the fieldies with the digger's license so that we could take diamonds from one location to another legally. And then if you wanted to, you could actually, just by renewing it privately, you could keep that digger's license for life. I was just wondering whether that right had been taken away when they reviewed the Minerals Act.
Yeah, well, nowadays you would actually get a permit to carry diamonds, or trade diamonds. So there are procedures in place, but again, they're not as flexible as they were in those days. And I mean, Bill might just want to comment. I mean, De Beers very successfully, in some areas back in the days he talked about, collected samples over farms. Quite often they would drill a water hole for the farmer, to as a trade-off to get access to the ground. And maybe Mike can comment on that too, Mike DeWitt. But Bill, you might add just to that. I mean, you were able to, and had to, in diamond exploration, you wanted to move quickly across the ground.
Yeah, you move quickly as possible across the ground, just get an idea of what's going on. We did drill a few boreholes for farmers, but that was fairly infrequent.
Yeah.
I never held a digger's license myself. The important thing with the pre-Minerals Act, and certainly during the Minerals Act, was not to dig a hole unnecessarily that might lead to accusations of you handling diamonds or something like that. Certainly, we would try and avoid recording the recovery of any diamonds during exploration, because in terms of the Precious Stones Act, that was a notifiable situation.
Okay.
So
I had a question for Keith, actually. That cross-section of the M1 pipe, you suggested it was blind, but it's it's intruded into granite, and it's only 150 million years, I think, has been dated at that age. It's a group 2, so it certainly wasn't exposed based on my recollection at surface, but it was surface overburden rather than being blind. But perhaps that's how it was interpreted at that time.
That's correct, Bill. In that section, it's blind, but you're quite right. It did come within 15 meters of surface, above which was weathered material.
Yeah, and it was another great one of a classic example of the surface enrichment that you get in pipes in Southern Africa. That erosion over 150 million years certainly gave you a nice kick in the top part of the pipe as well. Okay, thanks, Keith. Any other comments, questions, proposals?
We've got Michelle wanting to say something again.
Yeah,
Okay.
you just asked what my opinion was. I'm never as sort of defeatist, I think, as everybody else about mineral rights in the country. I do believe there's a lot that can be improved. I think we're getting there. I don't know if you know, but the latest mining charter actually says that we don't have to have BE, for example, and a lot of the other obstacles have been removed from prospecting rights. As far as the timing goes, yeah, I did the 3 years, and I think that is too long. It should be about a year. For mining, if you've put in your application correctly, and this is an important thing, is I've seen a lot of applications and a number of them are incomplete, or they're really rubbish. So it's also got to do with how good the application is and whether you've answered their questions. The DMR's job is just to tick the boxes to make sure that we're complying with the legislation. And so that's part of the reason why it will go through faster. It should be faster. If you have a mining right, though, they do prioritize those. So most mining rights where everything's in order, especially an important one where it's obvious there is going to be a mine. There's large numbers that are actually, people haven't even been on the ground. But if you've got a mine and it's looking good, they will normally put it through in about a year. And it's actually the environmental side that's slowing everything down.
Yeah, well, now you hit the nail on the head. Then you get to NEMA and all these other obstacles, Michelle.
Yeah, and I personally believe for prospecting, they really don't have to. I mean, I've done both mining and prospecting, and I find the environmental prospecting actually more onerous. You know, they make you jump over far more hoops than you actually have to do for mining, which is quite incredible. So if we could just get that concept across, it would certainly make everybody's lives, including the DMRE's lives, a lot better. But I don't want to make a big, long discussion on mineral rights. I think Marsfontein was extremely exciting. A tiny little mine, but boy, they managed to pay it off in no time at all. I think that's probably because Keith probably got paid pittance. Yeah,
well, I did work for Mike too, and I can sympathize with Keith. He was a hard taskmaster. You worked for him as well, Michelle. But anyway, thanks for that input, and we really need a discussion, and we're going to set that up on, as I say, how can we improve the situation, get onto deposits quicker, attract foreign investment in South Africa. And I think most of you will have seen yesterday that Montash and the DMR or the ministry have now walked away from objecting to the sort of once empowered, always empowered. So I guess there is, there are some positive signs coming out, and certainly the ANC document published in the lockdown and the Business for South Africa have come up with some fairly, positive documents. That's on paper. I guess the real secret will be in the implementation. So let's hope some of that follows through. But thanks everyone for the discussion. Thanks Keith for a really fun presentation. As you say, it was a fun project. I had some interesting times on it as well, and we look forward to the presentations to follow. So unless there's any more questions or comments, thanks Henny for running the show, and thanks everyone for pitching up this morning.
Thanks, Keith. As Jordan says, it was a great talk. It reminded him of the Bakerville and Kimberley early 80s days with Newmont.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Thanks,
Thank you.